Morning, but let's move on to this really important session. I'm really pleased to say that we have a lineup of senior military commanders, an esteemed Airpower academic and two industry leaders to lead the debate this afternoon, focusing on the tyranny of proximity in relation to the conflict in Ukraine, focusing on NATO's eastern flank and the High North. So please do give a warm round of applause to our panellists as they come onto the stage. Please welcome our first speaker, and I'm sure he is here waiting in the wings. It is, of course, General James B. Hecken. His role is to command NATO's air forces in Europe. Welcome, General.
Okay, I thought we were all coming up here together, so I guess it's just me. All right. Well, I was back talking to the panelists there, and it was kind of opportune that the Swedish air chief was there. And I think we all saw what happened over the past couple days. We're not over the goal line yet, but very, very welcome to them as they become the 32nd member of NATO. So congratulations to Sweden. And we'll hope everything goes well. I'd like to thank the Royal Air Force for putting this together. I took command just a little over a year ago, and this was the first event that I went to. And it was great because I was able to talk to everybody and meet all the air chiefs, and I'm looking forward to doing that again this year. What I've been asked to do is just talk a little bit about Ukraine and lessons learned. So I think I'll hit some of those highlights. Then we'll have the other panelist members come up here, and then I think we're going to entertain questions for about an hour or so. But when I look at the Ukraine situation, a lot of people have different lessons that they've learned out of it, and it kind of depends what service you're from. If you talk to the Army, you need more 155 rounds, right? You need more precision with HIMARS and those kind of things. When I talk about it from an airman's perspective, the big thing that I notice is that no one's able to get air superiority. And because no one can get air superiority, you end up with a fight that we're seeing today, which is almost like World War I kind of fights. You know, artillery rounds going back and forth, indiscriminate fires that are killing folks, civilians, hospitals are getting hit, schoolyards are getting hit, a lot of destruction and a lot of casualties. You know, the numbers are all over the place, but you can hear upwards of 60, 70,000 on the Russian side, 40,000 on the Ukrainian side. To put that in perspective, the U.S. lost 2,700 soldiers in 20 years in Afghanistan. And the numbers that I just talked about are after about 16 months. Now that is a war that we don't want to fight. We don't want to fight that. The people in the West, when I can speak for America, they wouldn't tolerate those kind of casualties. And if we can get air superiority, then we won't have those kind of casualties, but without it, that's what happens. Now let's ask ourselves, why were they unable to get air superiority? Both sides had a very sophisticated integrated air and missile defense system, so anytime each other's aircraft flew in the vicinity of the enemy's integrated air and missile defense, they were shot down. You know, over 75 Russian aircraft have been shot down so far. Ukrainian is over 50 aircraft have been shot down. If that didn't happen and Russia was able to get air superiority, all the stuff that all of our nations gave the Ukraine would have never got there, because it would have been stopped as soon as it went across the border into the Ukraine from Poland or Romania. There would have been a close air support up there, and it would have shot it in its tracks, and it would have never gotten there. And it's very important that it got there, because they were going to run out of their integrated air and missile defense if it wasn't for all of our nations giving them more integrated air and missile defense systems, whether it be NASAMS, whether it be Patriots, whether it be whatever the other countries gave. Now, how many countries are giving them things? You know, Secretary Austin calls everyone together, all the ministers of defenses. I think he's done it 13 times now since the beginning so almost monthly. And it always starts off with a little press. They're there. Secretary Austin will talk a little bit, and then the press leaves, and then President Zelensky typically dials in and will tell them, here's what we need. And then all their Air Force, their Army chief, they all say, here's what we need. And what they need in the last probably 10 of these is missiles to make sure that they can prevent Russia from getting air superiority. And that's what we're doing, and we're giving them. Now, Russia, what do they do since they couldn't get air superiority? Now they're driven to basically take off their bombers, strap cruise missiles to them, and launch them from long distances. A lot of those get shot down by the Ukrainians, but a couple get through all the time. What else do? They buy UAVs, one-way UAVs from Iran, and they send those across. So they're able to do some deep strike, and then obviously the Ukrainians we don't give them stuff that can get into Russia, so we're not getting them long-range stuff, but they can get stuff to kind of help them out on the lines there. So air superiority is very important, but just as important is the integrated air and missile defense, and that's where we need to do some work within NATO to make sure that we can ensure that Russia doesn't get air superiority. And the way we can do that is through combat air power, protecting our lands, and also integrated air and missile defense. And this is where we need to have a better strategy. Because the way we do it right now is every country buys their own thing, and then we basically pay somebody to make it interoperable with the other countries, so we're almost paying for it twice. So what we'd like to do is do integration by design and say, hey, here are the systems that we need, and now when we buy it, we already know that they're interoperable, so we don't have to pay somebody else to make them interoperable afterwards. And that's what we're terming integration by design. And we'll see how successful we are at that. I think Germany's doing a good job trying to help us out. They have 17 nations, and we just had 2 more that are non-NATO sign up for Sky Shield, and that's kind of getting us on the same sheet of music. We'll see how that goes. The problem is the nations that, and I'll freely admit, U.S. is a nation that hasn't signed on to this, and it's because it comes with certain, systems that you buy. And what I'm looking at to maybe get the other 14 nations to be able to sign this thing is just, hey, here's the capability that we need. It needs to be open architecture. You can buy whatever you want you can build it, in your country, I don't care. But this is what we need, and if you meet these specifications, then we'll be able to make it interoperable, and we can do integration by design, and it'll be a lot cheaper, and we can work together as I drop another pin on the floor. So, anyways, that's what we're kind of looking after. So my priorities is counter A2 AD is my number one priority, and that's to make sure that we can shut down the Russian integrated air and missile defense systems, their SA-21s, et cetera, so we have air superiority and freedom to operate. Okay, my number 2 priority is to make sure our integrated air and missile defense system is a lot better than it is right now, using integration by design. That would help out. Number 3 is an easy one. It's called information sharing. It's a lot more difficult than you think. But let me give you an example. When we started the Ukrainian war, the U.S. shared 30 points of interest to NATO members. You know how many we're sharing right now per month? It used to be 30 per month. Now we do 3,000 per month. Makes us all more capable. Cost $0. It was a stroke of a pen. It was a policy change. We're starting to do that with other systems, like the F-35. We just got the ability to share the U.S. mission data file to all the nations. Why is that important? Because now it makes us much more interoperable. Even though we had the same aircraft, we didn't have the same software. Now we're going to be able to have the same software. And by the next decade, we're going to have over 600 F-35s in the European theater, and less than 10% of them are going to be U.S. So we need to make sure that every F-35 maxes out its potential and can be interoperable with all the other F-35s. And we're making some good progress there. There's other things that we can share, and we're getting close. We're doing our first WebTAC, and that's in NATO, our first Weapons and Tactical Conference. And we're going to talk about getting after these priorities, A2A, DIAMD, those kind of things. But information sharing is free for the most part, and it increases our capability, and we've got to make sure we continue to do that. Fourth priority that I have is a command and control to make all this happen, and how we can do distributed command and control to make sure it's going to be there all the time and we don't put all of our folks in one building that if blown up, we lose a lot of capability. And then lastly, agile combat employment. I think you'll hear from the Swedish Air Chief. They are leads in this. When you talk to Finland, when you talk to Norway and Sweden, they really know how to do this, and he'll talk about it. We need to get the rest of NATO to the level that they're at and make sure that we can do agile combat employment. And for those of you who don't know what I mean when I talk about agile combat employment, it used to be that on a base, so when they dropped a bomb, we didn't have all our aircraft together. We would disperse them. Well, that's not good enough now with all the accuracy that they have in their weapons. So not only do we need to disperse it at the airfield, we need to disperse it amongst different airfields. And then we need to switch them up inside the adversary's decision cycle so that they can't find them and kill them on the ground. Okay, so I think I've used my 10 minutes. So I guess I'll hand it off to the next speaker, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, General. Thank you. So do take a seat, and I'm pleased to say you will not be alone on stage because we're going to welcome the other panelists onto the stage right now. So please do take a seat. Thank you.
I dropped your pen.
Pardon?
I dropped your pen.
Thank you. And to take the podium position for the next part of the session, please do welcome Major General Jonas, who, of course, as we've just been hearing from the General, is really has a lot of expertise in agile combat employment.
Right, generals, ladies and gentlemen, dear air and space chiefs, and General, we're standing behind you when you're on stage, but a little bit far behind maybe. So thank you for the introduction. I'm gonna talk. I mean, this is such a beautiful opportunity for me and such a great panel to be a part of, and I'm really humbled about that. I'm happy to speak before the rest of them, especially Justin, who will fill in all the blanks when I'm done. I mean, there's so much to talk about these days, and some of the topics was experiences from the Ukraine. I think there's a lot we can talk about. We can talk about the need to again talk about the need for air superiority. General Hecker was talking about that. That is one of our experiences as well, and we all need to talk more about that to explain the need of air superiority and to explain where the wars is going without it. We can also talk about the need for innovation. That's also a need for innovation and a need for a capability of innovation when that's needed. And we can talk about, which General Hecker talked very good about also, that is what we see in Ukraine with the long distance targeting from a position behind own air defense system, where the enemy can target us long distance, high speed, or unmanned aircrafts from a position well behind defended positions, and the consequences of that. And I'm going to talk about a piece of that. But I think everything of this is connected. Our capability to survive the fight, to fight the fight, to counter the opponent's air defense system and to target the system that is targeting us. Our way to do that, to survive the fight, is dispersed operations. We're getting well known for dispersed operations now. I think I can, quit my job and go around the world and teach about dispersed operations because it's popular term again. And I think rightfully so. And from our perspective, we have also had a long history of dispersed operations. We almost managed to shut that down during the period we've all been through, but we're back on it, and I'm going to give you a short insight about that kind of system. The picture itself is a Swedish aircraft, but it's landing on a road, but it's landing on a Finnish road. I think that is a good picture to start with. This picture was taken years ago, and this is what we try to reinvent in the north now, together with Finland and Norway, as mentioned. I think it's a kind of a nice picture. Just to give you a little bit of a background, and I think that's also a part of why we in Sweden kind of have so easily drawn conclusions from the war in Ukraine, because we have a history, a historic background where our position has more or less been a little bit like the Ukraine position. In the times where the Swedish Air Force has formed itself and formed our organization and operations, we did expect a future invasion from, at that time, Soviet Union. That is a part of Swedish culture. This is a part of a background, all anticipating a conflict where we were at that time maybe in the beginning neutral, now not so neutral anymore, and we were also unallied, and soon not so unallied anymore. We'll see. We're hoping for that. So this is a few pictures of that. Top right is a picture from the Swedish. The pamphlet that was sent to every Swedish citizen, an instruction on how to disperse agencies, people, in case of war, distributed to every household. And down right also a old Soviet map with a Swedish hospital depicted in dark green. So from our perspective, and I think this is true for us as partner and allies in this situation as well. There is always kind of a way to build. We have built our systems on tactical superiority. It sounds nice, but it's based on the knowledge that we can't face the threat that we are facing on quantity. We have never been in that position. Maybe we can face a threat with technology, and we are trying to do that. It's a technology sport, Airpower, but we are trying to. But in our knowledge, we can maybe keep up with the opponent. What we try to do is try to beat the or try to find a way to counter the challenge on the tactical arena. Air tactics, we can talk forever about. That's what we all try to do. But we have also focused historically on tactics on ground, and that is base operations. And that is our solution today, and I think it's also part of the future solution. So to survive the fight and fight again, to have base tactics and ground operations in a pace and in a way that we will survive and generate more sorties than the opponent. On the right, you see some bullets. We just want to press on the final bullet there. All those kind of efforts going into base operations, I will show you an in-depth slide later, also means that with the right kind of base operation, we will find the capability to concentrate and create asymmetry and to create air superiority at the moment in time we need it. Just some historical slides. This is, from the birth of the Swedish Air Force, soon to be 100 years. This is from the 30s, 40s, maybe, dispersed operations. Going through the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Now some of you start to recognize some of the aircrafts being dispersed in Swedish terrain. And going up until today, we have more or less the same dispersal system operating the Gripen aircraft right now and getting ready to take the next step. And I'm going to come back to that a little bit. Dispersed operations for us, General Hecker was mentioning it. I mean, we all talk about dispersed operations and agile combat, and we talk about logistics under attack. And we often mean the same thing, but we also mean different things. This is our way of, and our historical way to use the word dispersed operations. That means that the wing will normally have a home operating base. That's where the wing is established today. But the wing also have the orders in case of loss of communication or in case of perceived threat, move to another location. So that will be the first step when the wing moves from a home operating base to a main operating base or a forward operating base. And then we have 1 or 2 or 3 additional bases for the wing to move through. So that would be normally 3 or 4 air bases at the wing's disposal. At the forward operating base, the wing or the squadrons at that forward operating base will additionally have a main landing strip and then additional a few more landing strips, 3 or 4 more landing strips. That might be on a road, that might be a shorter landing strip, that might be also a landing strip on a commercial runway. The dispersed operations idea is then to move constantly between bases and constantly within bases in such a pace that targeting is hard or impossible for an opponent. So that means also that we need very fast turnarounds for our systems. And our aircrafts and our system, our training system is built on that from the beginning. Right now we have a speed of turning around a Gripen aircraft in less than 10 minutes with 1 officer and 4 to 5 maintainers. They can be conscripts. So 1 officer and 5 conscripts will turn around a Gripen aircraft in the air-to-air role on an airbase. And that we try to keep that pace up in such a way that the targeting is not really possible. Also, a few words to mention on the what's needed for dispersed operations. What we have found out is that we need to readjust our organization. We need to readjust our leadership, because dispersed operations will work and come into effect at that point where it's able to disperse and move between and within bases without communications to higher command. So there will have to be a culture on extreme mission command when it comes to base operations. I see my time is running out. I'm going to use my last 6 seconds to point a little bit into the future. And this is a Swedish road. And I think going back to the start of my presentation, I think we are recognizing that all our experiences is more or less connected to each other. So in order to solve the future military problem or the current military problem, we need to be able to counter or to figure out how to unlock the air defense in order to target and defeat the assets that are threatening us or shooting at us. But in order to do that, we also need to survive the fight. We also need to survive the first fight. A part of that is the dispersed operation. And I think we are all talking about looking ahead when it comes to dispersed operation. I think a thing worth mentioning is in order for us to do this, it has to be multinational. I think air power is at its best when it's combined. Air power is at its best when you combine strength between nations and strength between domains. So multinational and multi-domain. And that also goes to the dispersed operations. Our next step would be to find a way to cross-service, to dispersed, cross-domain, multinationally, and to bring that fight from the ground up to cross-usage, integrated operations and cross-domains operations. That would be our next step. That concludes my brief. Happy to be back answering questions and discussions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Major General. Thank you. And now I'd like to hand over the floor to Air Marshal Harvey Smyth, who's going to give the Royal Air Force perspective. Thank you.
Well, Air and Space Chiefs, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I have already learnt a couple of valuable lessons today. The first one was when your PSO says to you, you're giving your speech on an iPad, do you want me to do a paper backup? You should say yes. Because my iPad is now sat over there doing an Office 365 update. And if you're right there, Robbie, I'm not sure where you are, but thank you for your emergency iPad. You're a good PSO. The second lesson I've learnt is when you're doing your 4th conference on this topic, and you always follow General Hecker, there are going to be a certain amount of sandwiches stolen. I don't apologise for going over some of the ground. Maybe it'll help reinforce it. The only good thing is I get to steal whatever was left for Justin. So that's good. But thank you very much indeed for the opportunity to say a few words here today on what I consider probably the most pressing topic of this conference, talking about the High North, the Eastern Flank, and the importance of NATO. And frankly, it's even better to be on stage with so many good friends and colleagues again. Never in my 30 plus years in the service, most of which frankly has been operationally focused, have I seen the Royal Air Force so globally busy. Nor indeed have I sensed such a palpable concern regards the danger we currently face in the here and now. And more importantly, the unpredictability of what might come next. Who would have forecast a Wagner revolt and their recent march on Moscow? And what does their relocation to Belarus actually mean? Is it exile, or is it the opening of a new fighting front? What might come next week, next month, in the next 10 years? Indeed, a period which is more often than not now being referred to as the dangerous decade. Uncertain times for sure, and by dint of our geography, and I use this map purposely because you see the world from where you sit, and if you're from the UK, we're the tiny little blob in the top left-hand corner there. The UK must take an all-aspect view in its approach. We look to the West, to our key ally, the USA, both in terms of alignment, but more importantly, our role as NATO's strategic depth, where not only do we provide basing for the US's only fifth-gen footprint here in Europe, but in reality, should a European-focused Article 5 be triggered, this green and pleasant land will once again undoubtedly find itself acting as a strategic infill point for the mass of US forces. Hence, it must be protected across all the domains. We look to our immediate north and the Atlantic, specifically the critical national infrastructure that lies beneath it, energy, connectivity, and also for us of strategic importance, the operating environment for our nuclear deterrent, where through capabilities such as our P8 Maritime Force, Quick Reaction Alert North, our growing space-based capabilities, and key alliances such as the Joint Expeditionary Force, we look to understand and protect our northern flank. Further north still, and to the high north and the Arctic, which is ever more important to the UK's environment, prosperity, energy supply and security. This region has historically enjoyed constructive international cooperation and is currently characterised by low tension. And obviously we wish this to remain so and will work constructively with those of a similar mindset. However, the region is changing as a consequence of climate change, and the opening up of the Arctic raises the potential for defence and security concerns, not just emanating from the region itself, but spreading into it from state competition and conflict elsewhere around the globe. Russia, obviously, views the Arctic as strategically sensitive, and the melting ice exposes its northern flank. Russia is increasingly militarizing its Arctic territory. It has steadily increased military activity and invested in infrastructure in the region. Russia's submarine activity in the North Atlantic has reached and indeed surpassed Cold War levels. These are all challenges which impact upon the interests of the UK, our allies and partners, and to which we must be vigilant and prepared to respond if needed. Beyond, China is also increasingly investing its activity in this region, pursuing a polar Silk Road as an extension of its broader Belt and Road Initiative. So such heightened competition means the era of Arctic isolationism is ending, and we need to be prepared to protect and, where appropriate, assert our rights against those who wish to challenge the rules-based international order, freedom of navigation, or threaten the stability of the region in other ways. Within NATO, the UK plays a particular role in protecting our underwater interests and ensuring our freedom to operate in the North Atlantic, especially across the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. The UK MOD and the RAF within it will continue to ensure that it remains capable of protecting the UK's interests as the Arctic opens up, and we aim to preserve the stability and security of that region. But perhaps the most pressing and depressing as we look to the east, we see a war started by a brutal Russian regime which pays as little attention to the sanctity of the rules-based international order as it does to how many civilians it kills on an hourly basis. A war at its heart which presents scenes of devastation both in terms of lives lost and a country destroyed, the likes of which is more reminiscent of a scene from the trenches of World War I. Certainly not the modern, clean, surgical, next-generation warfare we have often talked about at conferences such as this. A war which on a daily basis reinforces that we, as airpower experts, already knew. Control of the air, and of ever-increasing importance, control of space, really does matter, both in terms of protecting our own airspace in integrated air and missile defence, and having the ability to punch into the airspace of our adversary, counter integrated air defence. In Ukraine, we see an exemplar, as General Hecker mentioned, of what happens when neither side can gain meaningful control of the air. You get a meat grinder, a tit-for-tat conflict, a conflict which lasts a long time, where souls lost are measured in the hundreds of thousands, and families and lives destroyed in the millions, where cities are pulverized, and frankly, success is described in the gaining of single kilometers of geography. This is not the type of fight we want to become embroiled in. Hence, deterrence is absolutely key, and more so than ever. Deterrence through strength, strength through alliances, and with NATO continuing to be our cornerstone. As our Defence Secretary recently said at the Shangri-La dialogue, Russia's illegal war in Ukraine is forcing a rethink of the Euro-Atlantic security architecture, and it has spurred yet more countries to seek the collective security of NATO. And it is indeed an absolute privilege to be on stage with the next newest member of NATO. From a NATO perspective, the resurgence of a major war on the continent of Europe and the growing threats from elsewhere across the globe mean that more than ever, we need to sharpen our approach to ensure our warfighting capabilities are robust, aligned, and credible, if indeed we are to deter such threats from manifesting in the first place. But if they do, being able to fight and win quickly and convincingly. The last 2 years have only served to reinforce the centrality of NATO to the national security of this region. Our unity has held firm despite the many challenges faced, and our interoperability, core to our strength, is reinforced daily. The Royal Air Force continues to conduct NATO air patrols over Poland, Estonia, Romania. We provide significant intelligence capabilities, air-to-air refueling, modern strategic transport, as well as highly capable fourth and fifth generation combat platforms, some of which are carrier-borne. And as NATO goes through its most radical transformation since the Cold War, our commitment to the new NATO force model will be no less fulsome. But finally, despite the uncertainty offered by this dangerous decade, one assumption is as good as certain. We are stronger together, and indisputably, NATO remains key to that strength. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Air Marshal, for that really great overview. And now I'd like to introduce to the podium somebody many of you know very well, Professor Justin Bronk, for his extensive knowledge from a Chinese and Russian perspective, but also for his research with Ukrainian armed forces as well. Over to you, Justin.
Thank you. Hopefully the mic is working. So, sandwiches stolen to some degree, but hopefully not entirely, because essentially the two messages, I couldn't agree more, that came out really strongly for me, particularly from General Hecker and from Harvey's presentations there. We need air superiority, and we need to be ready to defend our way of life through essentially credible conventional deterrence against Russia. We don't want to fight like that, and we know how we plan to fight to avoid it. However, I'm a simple man, and to be honest, just came back from Ukraine yesterday, actually, but when I spent a bit of time there over the last year and a half, and the Ukrainians see things in very, very simple terms for the most part. Less doctrinally sophisticated, but I find often quite helpful. So what I'm going to try and do is just perhaps express things in a simpler way, and arrogantly enough, given how many chiefs and fantastically accomplished and experienced aviators and experts and industry folk are here, try and give you all a set of objectives as a humble taxpayer. That wasn't me, by the way. So first of all, why do we need to do this? First thing I'd say is those who believe that Russia is going to be beaten quickly or is not going to be a medium-term threat or is somehow worn out are, I'm afraid, simply deluding themselves. It is not true. The Russians, if you look at, you can take what you think of them, but let's look at either their words or their deeds. Well, their words, I'd say, how many people here have watched a bit of Russian state TV on a regular basis over the past year and a half, or watched any of the debates in the Duma or Putin's kind of discussions, quote unquote, with his leadership at the end of a very, very long table? It's honestly blood-curdling. When people tell you who they are, you probably should listen, because they're not talking about how to end the war. They're talking about how to win it as a first stage. The questions they're talking about on their state TV and between their officials is, should they stop at the Ukrainian border? Should we nuke maybe Poland, maybe Warsaw, perhaps London as a demonstration? Honestly, we all know that that's ridiculous right now. They're conventionally completely strung out. Nuclear deterrence still holds. But you really should actually pay attention to the way that they're viewing the world. For example, the rebellion by Prigozhin, quote unquote, I must admit I see that as theatre. If that was a real coup, every single person involved or suspected of being involved would be dead. The Russians don't, excuse the language, fuck around. That's not a real coup. Even if it were, who'd you get in its place in terms of Putin? You'd get Patrushev or Prigozhin or someone like that. You are not getting a way out of the confrontation that they've set up. Or look at their actions. They've already got close to doubling their output of shells for production based on last year on their projections for this year. Their target is 7 million shells a year in 4 years' time. They're continuing to mobilize roughly another 130,000 conscripts every 6 months, just as they did before, but this time they're not letting them go out of the rotation. Tank production is up. Missile production is going up. UAV production has skyrocketed. None of this is going away. Russia's economy is hurting, but they are not going away. Their strategy is to outlast all of you in Europe and in the West. And right now, unfortunately, our inventories are getting pretty, empty. And aside from the US, where there's been huge investment in munitions production, which will kick in a year or two's time, I haven't seen the same in Europe yet. We need to stop thinking we can win this on the cheap. Because secondly, if the US is playing, fully agree. A lot of our concepts and a lot of ACE and working together, pretty much with what we have now, probably works. But the US has its own problems too in the Indo-Pacific with its allies and partners there. The decade of danger, how many people think there will be a US Iron Mountain that will be coming into the European theatre to help us out if they are concurrently involved in an invasion of Taiwan that they're trying to prevent, or if war has broken out on the Korean Peninsula, or there's been a flashpoint in the South China Sea that's spiraled from there? In the 2026 through 2028 timeframes, the US military is desperately stretched against the Chinese threat from there in that theatre, against their objectives to defend their allies, some of whom they're treaty bound as well as morally bound to do. So they're going to be pulling stuff out of Europe, not putting it back in. They're going to need us to cover things. We need to be ready in that 2026 to 28 timeframe to defend against a concurrent threat, because what is the most likely point when a steadily rearming and very embittered Russia will actually choose to do something against Europe? Against NATO allies, for example, or against Ukraine after whatever sort of ceasefire has broken out there? Well, it's exactly then, when the US is involved elsewhere and can't come and help us. So we need to be ready to deter. Luckily, it's pretty simple in terms of, as far as I can see it, what you need to be able to do. We rely on air superiority to kill these things. Russia's tanks, Russia's artillery, Russia's thermobaric weapons, massed Russian infantry. They're not going to be able to produce some sort of revolution in military capability. It'll be the same old stuff that we see now, in large quantities, pretty dumb, although they are learning lessons. And the problem is with this stuff is if you don't have air superiority, we just don't have the barrels, we don't have the ammo, we don't have the force sizes, and we can't recruit, let alone pay for armies to fight them at their own game. We need air superiority. But if we do have air superiority, This stuff will simply be vaporized one BTG at a time by a massive 4th and 5th generation air power with direct attack munitions. Air forces in Europe are very, very good at close air support and air interdiction. So, simple mission. You have to be able to kill these at scale. All you need to do, as General Hecker said, his priority is counter A2AD, counter IA air and missile defense. It's these things. They're mobile, so they move quickly. You can't just target based on position or on ARM, so anti-radiation missiles. You need to be able to hunt them down with an active seeker. They're defended. Point defenses working really well in Ukraine. Almost every single munition of any significance is being regularly intercepted at times by Russian A2AD, so long-range systems and short-range systems. That includes HIMARS, that includes HARM, that includes multiple launch rocket systems of various kinds. So your PK of your weapons will be nowhere near 1, so you need quite a few of them. But they are finite. How many targets do you reckon that Western air power has taken out over the last 15, 20 years with supreme precision for the most part, often in very difficult, complex environments, in multiple different countries, at huge reach at some times? I mean, it's tens of thousands. You only need to kill a couple of hundred of these things. They are finite. The Russians cannot produce them en masse like they can tanks and simple artillery and conscripts. They also can't produce trained crews for them that quickly. And how fast do they actually think they're going to be able to replace combat losses if you start taking them out at scale? They're also crewed by people who are vulnerable to being tired, hungry, scared, out of fuel, and deprived of good information. How quickly will their engagement protocols and their tactics start degrading if every time one of those SA-27s or 17s lights up, it takes a Spear 3 or an ARGM-ER to the face? I reckon those tactics will start changing pretty quick. You can take the IADs out by going after the big stuff first, and hoping it will destabilize so you can nibble from the outside, or go from the outside first so that you can get better solutions on the big stuff further in. But you've got to do it one way or another. And they're expensive. Russia cannot mass produce these things. So luckily, we have a lot of the solutions already. We've got aircraft, particularly the F-35, with sensor suites that will geolocate in a part of a foreship in particular, a SAM when it pops up within engagement range, almost instantaneously. The question is, do you have enough of them, and are the pilots there trained to employ against those particular target sets in the SEAD-DEAD role? Or are you counting on them to do so many things in your Air Force because you bought so few of them that actually they're trained across 10 or 12 different mission sets and none of them well? Do you have enough munitions with active seeker heads and sufficient standoff distance in sufficient quantities to actually kill these things, not just suppress them? Anti-radiation missiles suppress, they generally don't kill. So, are you also training your people to use these things effectively and the rest of the force to actually exploit when you do have a window and to enable those DEAD missions? If you're trying to do clever multi-domain integration things like bringing in HIMARS, for example, how often are Army HIMARS batteries included as a regular component in things like we saw with the big air exercises recently? How many SEAD squadrons, when they go out and do training, have an Army HIMARS battery supporting them for real? How many Army inventories of Gimler's missiles how many proportions of those missiles are actually dedicated to Air Force fire missions? I'm guessing the answer is not very many at the minute. So if you're going to rely on this stuff, great, but you have to practice with it, you have to plan for it, and you have to buy ammo for it. The other thing is you're going to have to, as General Hecker pointed out with ACE, and we heard very well from Jonas, you're going to have to stay ahead of Russian strikes on the ground. They have a lot of missiles, they'll keep building them, they'll keep building Goran and other things, but A, those missiles can be intercepted, B, the launch platforms are finite, and C, their targeting process is slow, although it is speeding up. So you can either disperse or harden, but you're going to have to do some of it. Dispersal, you've got the USAF ACE model, varies by theatre, but essentially move bases regularly and warfight at distance for a given number of days. That does rely, though, on having lots of ability to either pre-position supplies or bring in heavy support to bring in additional fuel, weapons, targeting cells, personnel, all of that stuff from CONUS in their case. But it's no good just keeping the aircraft going. You also have to keep your maintenance, your logs, and your sustainment, and your C2. You can build a dispersed force from scratch, like the Swedes and the Finns. That's one approach. You can harden with some air defense. Personally, having experienced Russian missile raids with Patriot nearby and without Patriot nearby, I can guarantee you it's not just physically, it's also psychologically a completely different experience. And you can harden. I would actually say hardening is a really cost-effective thing to do. The Russians can only target most of our air bases with expensive, finite, long-range missiles that are not perfectly accurate, especially when EW is at play. So, if you make it one missile per aircraft at best, that's not a very good trade-off for them, and HASs are cheap compared to air defense. My recommendation would be a mix of all four approaches across the alliance, because different people, different air forces will have different optimal solutions for them. But you have to stay ahead of the long-range targeting. So, conclusions, you need to do serious investment in training, ammunition, spares, redundancy, and hardening for warfighting. Because fundamentally, control of the air is fundamentally what air forces are for. You may have to fight the Russians in the 3 to 5 year time period, and you in Europe may have to do it without major US support. If you're not able to assure control of the air over that battle space, then you're not fit for purpose. And you need to stop doing other things in order to free up the money to buy the ammo, to do the training at scale, and to harden so you can credibly do that core mission. That's what you're for. And so either you're going to have to get a lot more money, in which case you have to make the case to your politicians. It's interesting, in Germany and in the UK, when, excuse the language again, shit hit the fan last February, the Army's approach in both the UK and Germany was essentially to say, we have nothing. There's nothing we can offer. Our force is hollow, there's nothing there. And the approach of both air forces was to say, look, we're doing lots of stuff, lots of packages everywhere. Look how responsive we are. We are a policy instrument that does stuff when you pull the lever, therefore you should invest in us. Both perfectly valid strategies. I would observe that in both the UK and Germany, the debate on defense is how do we fix the army? So their approach seems to work better. If no uplift is viable, you're going to have to cut other things. Heavy lift, permissive ISTAR, permissive strike capabilities are all fantastic, useful things that you will find all sorts of uses for all over the world all the time. But as I said, if you can't control the air, you're not doing your job. That's me.
Real food for thought from Justin Bronk there. As always, it's our can-do attitude that perhaps is at fault here. But thank you very much for that. More from you a little bit later. So now it's getting the industry perspective with Heidi Grant, who's President of Business Development at Boeing. Over to you, Heidi.
Yeah, thank you. What an honor it is to be with this all-star panel today. Thanks for the organizers for inviting me and giving me this opportunity. I have to admit, though, I did have a little bit of anxiety. The last time I was on a panel this robust was about 2 years ago, and the topic was foreign military sales. I made a few provocative comments, and the next day I announced my retirement of 32 years with the Department of Defense, and somehow media put that together and said that I had a problem with the political environment and I was resigning, which was not true. So just a disclaimer up front, my comments today are bipartisan. Some will be provocative, but that's what we're here for, is to have those discussions. And I hope I don't have a resignation after this. But anyway, as recent events remind us, the environment in Europe, it has been telling for the fragility of global peace and stability. And it's a stark reminder that stability in Europe doesn't just matter to Europe. There's a global issue that we all need to get after. The strengthening of Europe's security environment, it's going to require collective efforts of not only nations, but our partners and, importantly, industry. There's some capability gaps across the domains, and there's a lot of work to do, but recent strong commitments to focus on defense and ongoing efforts to accelerate acquisitions, I can tell you, is a welcome and positive step forward. That said, acquiring capability alone, it's not enough. From my Boeing industry lens, I want to highlight 3 areas Boeing and my industry partners can best contribute to global security and stability. The first is innovation, second is allied by design, and commitment to global partnerships. Innovation, as General Hecker mentioned a little bit in his comments, it's the best defense in today's security environment. Technology determines how wars are fought and won. Advances are being made in commercial technology, artificial intelligence, defense, autonomy, electronic warfare, cyber, and others. Technology is everywhere and advancing at an incredible pace. Safe to say, technology doesn't know its application until we tell it. And I think many of us have seen this on the battlefield, where our operators often take the technology and use it in ways that are effective that we had no idea that they would be able to do. So Again, getting that technology as soon as we can out in the warfighters' hands is so important for our global security. Our investment in autonomy is a strong nod to the future of warfare. Autonomy is a great enabler of agility and key to winning the future fight, not with a singular new aircraft or weapon, but rather a mix of autonomous technology platforms working together seamlessly in a battle space with multiple players. We're making great strides in advanced modeling and simulation in contested environments, where we can see how air, land, sea, and space systems will work together in simulated environments to achieve mission success. We're adopting digital technologies to increase mission readiness and save costs. For example, digital operational training and readiness improvements have saved fleets thousands of hours in maintenance. You heard some of this morning on the sustainment discussion. Reduce the amount of unscheduled maintenance, save thousands of pounds in fuel, and significantly increase the amount of time a platform is mission ready. The only way we'll keep the warfighting edge is to pull together what I call a whole of society approach to innovation. And events like this Global Air Chief Conference and Space Chief Conference, it provides an important forum for necessary conversations to get a better understanding of what's needed to enhance partnerships, integration, and operability. Similar to the operational strength we experience when a military coalition works together, we must bring together the best of our global industries and combine our strengths to provide the innovation and the technological advances that will enhance our global security. The threats and challenges we face are only getting more urgent and more complex. The ability to fight jointly with air, land, sea, and space systems that are interoperable by design between domains and among allies and partners is absolutely critical to maintaining a competitive edge. Mission readiness is not a job that any one government or one company can accomplish alone. If there's one thing we learned from the pandemic, it was that innovation, partnerships, and stable global supply chain are the only way we'll survive in a contested environment. A retired US four-star general that served in the EUCOM area, I asked him, I said, what have you learned now that you've retired that you wish you knew when you were commanding? He said, I thought I knew everything that industry had to offer. He goes, it wasn't until I retired and started working closer and in industry that I found out about all these capabilities that I wish I would have known about when I was leading the warfighters. So from my perspective, it's our job in industry to ensure our warfighters know and understand the full spectrum of capabilities that we have to offer to our military partners. With technology, we have a tremendous opportunity to drive operational advantages, usefulness, and resiliency for the armed forces by ensuring we have dependable supply chains, advanced applied technologies, integrated by design, or as I refer to, allied by design, with exportability considered from the beginning, offered at the speed of relevance, with a clear and agile acquisition process to get capability into the hands of the people who need them most. Last year, the US Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, he tasked a Tiger team to look into how to improve the foreign military sales process. As many of you know, there were a variety of recommendations to include capturing ally and partner requirements as early as possible, enabling efficient reviews for technology release, and providing ally and partners relevant capabilities, to name a few. Industry is fully engaged, and we're watching carefully to ensure we have production capacity and the surge capacity we need. We have come a long way, and we'll continue to work alongside the US government to be more flexible. We continue to adapt to meet the technological needs of allies and partner militaries and provide opportunities to integrate ally and partner nation systems into US platforms, to include things that are non-program of record that many of you are asking for. We know our military partners need to operate with urgency and speed due to rapidly evolving threats. It's our priority to meet your timelines. The threat requires us to accelerate delivery of critical capabilities to the warfighter, be proactive, and ensure that we remain technologically dominant in today's world with so many competing priorities, as mentioned previously. That may mean replacing current aircraft with more efficient options, scaling the development and production of sustainable aviation fuels, and leveraging data and digital tools where possible to streamline costs and accelerate learning and training. We are moving much faster with digital design and production by using a digital thread that decreases rework, maximizes first-time quality, and it eliminates duplication in design, analysis, test, and sustainment. So I couldn't agree more with the previous panel this morning and the idea that sustainability is a matter of global security. To me, the more sustainable, lower cost, energy efficient we become, regardless of the business you're in, it'll lead to more effective operations. The same goes for our supply chains. We need durable supply chains that are stable, predictable, efficient, and global. Beyond sustainability, there's a whole host of areas where collaborating among allies and partners and fortifying our relationships will pay dividends in global security and future-proofing a modern alliance. With shifting global security and an age of heightened strategic competition, Allied by Design allows U.S. industry to scale up, meet growing global demand among allies and partners now and in the future. So simply stated, we can't do this alone. It's a close collaboration between industry and the government that will empower transformative gains in key areas ensuring collective security, sustainability, resilience, and success. For nearly half a century, as a global company, Boeing has worked with more than 40 countries around the world to successfully complete industrial engagement programs, totaling close to $55 billion. These programs have delivered significant benefits to economies and communities by establishing aerospace and defense supply chains and services infrastructure, creating jobs, enabling prosperity. We're doing that in Europe, and we'll continue to build on the enduring legacy we have established thus far. With global sustainment, we need the right parts and the right materials in the right places so our teams can do the necessary sustainment work. So we've partnered with military services and governments to accelerate production of capabilities, relying on our suppliers so we could be a production accelerator. Those areas will require our collective willingness and ability to make necessary investments in developing the capabilities we need, moving at an accelerated pace. But why that conversation that we need to have is right here, right now, on how we can all collectively work together. It's going to take the government, private industry, military, and academia. But that is exactly why we're here, to have the stimulating conversations that will drive innovation, strengthen NATO, and ultimately enhance global security. Together, with our defense industry partners, we have the best equipment, we have the best technology, we have the best people, and of course, unmatched ingenuity. When the defense industry combines our capabilities with our partners and allies, we are unstoppable. Innovation, allied by design, and commitment to global partnerships. Together, we can share information, skills, and techniques that will define what's on the other side of history and what our adversaries will fear. Thanks.
And finally, we turn to Rick Breckenbridge, Senior Vice President for Strategy and Growth at Northrop Grumman Aeronautics Systems.
Air and Space Chiefs, distinguished leaders, ladies and gentlemen, truly a privilege for me to be here today. I know it's the last speaker after the plenary after lunch, and they dim the lights, so I can't tell whether or not you're falling asleep or not. But let me start out by commending the organizers of this important symposium to invite a career submariner to address this group, a bold move. You're going to get a different perspective today. And General Hecker, after 36 years of Navy service and 5 years now in the defense industry, I feel I finally infiltrated behind enemy lines and had the opportunity to see what really goes on in these air and space conferences. So it is a great privilege for me to be here. I do have a lot of experience in the high north in the undersea domain. There are a lot of similarities between space and the area layer, as there is from the seabed floor with the sensors and other long-term dwell things that we have there, and the water column, the undersea domain. Perhaps during questions and answers we can get to some of those similarities, but I'm not going to address them specific in my remarks. Very tempted to talk to you from a military construct, but I'm going to address you from an industry perspective. So I'd like to start with 5 overarching technologies, trends that I see that are important, both for the fight in the high north, the eastern flank, NATO, as well as Westpac. And I'll just rattle these off really quick, and again, open to discuss these more during the Q&A. Number 1, uncrewed collaborative combat aircraft. This has been aspirational. I'm sure many of these past conferences that this topic has been discussed, but I see that freight train building momentum and coming quickly. I think it is going to change the nature of future conflict in the air domain and on how we graft that ability to generate affordable mass into the NATO construct. There's a lot of talk about the word interoperability. Recently, I've been hearing this term interchangeability more regularly, and that is sort of the ubiquity of these unmanned or uncrewed assets and how they can go from country to country. It can take off from Sweden. It can be controlled by Finland. It can land in Norway. We're going to become much more agnostic with regard to how we utilize that uncrewed aspect of air warfare. Number 2, the space and area layer fusion, ISR and T. And I'm just here to tell you, oftentimes I'm in circles where we pit one against the other. We say, well, space is going to pretty soon be able to do everything, and you really don't need things in the aerial domain. I think it's a false dichotomy. You need both, and there's reinforcing aspects of how you can utilize both to close the kill chain. We are really at the precipice of continuous target track quality, whether that be in the maritime domain, whether that be monitoring airfields, bomber airfields, whether that be some of the counter C2 that we talked about earlier today. Number 3, knitting our diverse, disparate, and I will now say dispersed forces together, the 3 Ds. The general mentioned early in his remarks about information sharing. I think there's a lot we can do with technology to break down some barriers. Certainly there's some policy barriers, some lawfare barriers between countries, within the U.S. services. We certainly have to tear down those walls, but there are some solutions that we can do within technology that can increase decision superiority with better information sharing. The goal here is not to concentrate forces, it's to concentrate fires, and to do that dispersed. And how do we go ahead and challenge Red and cost impose upon Red to deal with a much more difficult problem than a mass forces. It's a massed effects. I think combined GASCC23 is going to be important for that. There's going to be some incremental steps as we go forward, both industry as we support the warfighting going forward. Number 4, digital engineering. This idea of being able to have a common shared architecture that is open and to be able to move much faster between industry and the warfighter with how we modernize, develop, not just how we design and produce. Oftentimes we talk about digital engineering in those terms, but how do we go ahead and improve and work at the speed of digital. I'll tell you that industry, I'm a retired admiral that went to industry, same Heidi's comments, very relevant. But we reflect the customer in a lot of ways. And industry is a lot like NATO. We have a lot of strong partners that like doing things their own way. They like to safeguard their secret sauce, the proprietary information, and stay in these stovepipes. We all try to do it on our own with our own kit. We can no longer afford to operate like that. It's not fast enough. and it's too easy for red to slow us down at the seams. So this is a perfect technology area where we can leverage our strategic advantage of NATO, and that is we have a lot of parts that we not only want to add, the sum of the whole being greater than the sum of the parts, but we want to multiply. And we'll be able to do that if we can get more trust and more collaboration in the digital environment. And last but not least, number 5, AI, artificial intelligence, enabled man-machine teaming. And again, I think there's a lot of things here we can use AI for as a tremendous tool and aid to the operator, so we don't have to do as much churn in the fog of war, but instead we ride on the loop and use the humans to really fight the war. I think it boils down to, it's nothing new. Clausewitz probably says the same thing. It boils down to what can we see, what can we know, and then what can we do about it faster, and becoming integrated by design. So now what I'd like to do is I'd like to switch over to the topic of the High North and use an example of some trends that I'm seeing that are very encouraging from an industry perspective. So let's focus on the recent Nordic Air Forces agreement signed early this year in March. This is a commander's intent memorandum of understanding, but I view it as a big deal. So Sweden, a strong partner, NATO is interesting to me as they become number 32, but they're a signatory to this idea of unifying the High North Air Forces in a much more robust way, tearing down lines and seams between Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and Norway. I think it's a trendsetter. I think it's a first effort to go ahead and do this at a smaller level, and then how do we scale that up across Europe and then eventually to the Pacific. It's important to consider that the combined areas of responsibility of Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland extend from the coastline of Greenland to the North Pole, over to the Barents Sea, and down to the Baltic Sea, appropriately referred to as the NATO Lake. And with Kaliningrad located right in the middle of the NATO Lake, Russia poses a persistent challenge to NATO's High North beyond the threat along the Finland border. Situational awareness, such a broad area of responsibility, is hampered by a lack of satellites and organic airborne early warning reconnaissance and long dwell surveillance aircraft. With the commander's intent, the Nordic region is undertaking its first project, and that's the Nordic AOC, a critical step to ensure information can be shared across the Nordic nations with much greater openness and agility. Industry will need to assist the Nordic Air Forces in key areas, many of which were outlined in NATO's 2022 strategic concepts. Here are 4. Establishing an integrated and connected central planning process and headquarters. The backbone of that, industry will have a great opportunity to contribute to the development. Number 2, developing greater technical cooperation, much as I mentioned in one of my first 5 overarching strategic objectives from an industrial perspective manner. Number 3, supporting the urgent requirement for robust connectivity and common C2 capabilities. And last, providing uninterrupted near real-time situational awareness of shared areas of interest. So when it comes to situational awareness, we need increased polar orbits in the space domain, as well as high-altitude, long-endurance ISR systems in the air domain. These will be essential in providing the fidelity and persistence that is required. One aerial system, a little bit of a Northrop Grumman commercial here, is that can provide that persistent ISR coverage of this vast area is the Triton, a maritime variant of the NATO Alliance Ground Surveillance UAS. Over the past 2 decades, allies in NATO, Korea, Japan, Australia, and the US have added uncrewed hail systems to enhance wide area surveillance, particularly over littoral and maritime territories. These advanced systems carry out ISR targeting, comms relay, human assistance, disaster relief, and other missions critical to regional security. I am also seeing my time vanishing before my very eyes. So let me shift over to the eastern flank. Clearly the war in Ukraine shows how perilous that eastern flank is, with Poland, and not only Poland, but Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia really feeling that ever-present threat. And what types of technological solutions can we provide when speed matter and delivery times and active production lines become even more critical? For such a country as Poland, advanced airborne early warning control capabilities can improve integrated air and missile defense by 3 to 4 times, deterring or eliminating significant losses from Russian attack. The E-2D AWACS system will soon be operated in France and could provide a near-term solution to Poland and the eastern flank. So there's just a couple of examples from the High North. Really looking forward to your questions. In closing, the alliance continues to grow stronger. Industry can serve as a unifying force, bringing more robust capabilities to ensure air and space domain superiority. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. So lots to discuss, and already we have a lot of questions that have come through, but you can also raise your hands. But I'm going to go with some of the questions that we have on Slido to start off with. The first question really relates to the agility that we were talking about a little bit earlier. And the question's coming from Ben Lolly is, do you believe Generation 4-5 aircraft with their complex supply chain systems and life support systems are really capable of operating in agile and austere ways that ACE necessitates? I mean, it's hard to picture an F-35 being operated in the way a Harrier was, for example. So, Air Marshal Smyth, can you take this one?
Yeah. So this is what our whole approach to agile combat employment is about. I'll take that challenge. I think we can operate an F-35 like we operated a Harrier. It is more complicated. We already have plans for certain exercises, particularly in the High North with our partners, to take those assets there and to start trying it. I guess my whole approach to it has been, if you don't try it, you won't know where the holes are. So that's what's happening at the moment. So the big focus, certainly for this next year, is to start exercising in a meaningful way. Certainly through the lens of Royal Air Force, my challenge to the front row here has been every exercise we do must have an ACE element. And we've seen that play out just in this last couple of weeks where we had jets go out of Estonia, where they're frankly there to do NATO air policing, but we had them in the High North doing ACE-type work, being refueled in a FARP, etc. You'll certainly see Typhoons operating off road strips here in the next few months. And I guess if I have my way, we'll be doing that with the F-35 as well, as an ex-Harrier guy. Obviously, I had to say that because I'm sure there's a sweepstake somewhere for someone to say, how long will it take him to tell us all he was an ex-Harrier guy?
Okay, thank you. Well, let me get the perspective from Sweden on this. Major General Jonas Wikman, what's your take about in terms of the aircraft needed to really bring ACE to life and allow it to operate most effectively? Do you think there are issues with certain generation of aircraft?
I mean, it's going to be a challenge, but I think we are on the way. I mean, from our perspective, it's also very much in our interest. And like I said before, it's not only 4th, 5th generation capabilities integration in the air, it's also in the ground, at the ground and our ground operations. And we're planning and getting prepared for that, cross-servicing different kind of platform, including 5th generation aircraft platform. It's going to be a journey. I mean, it's still early on that kind of journey. It's still security issues, but you know that we will take care of that over time. So you know that's in our plan and directions.
Okay, thank you. We have another question, which is...
Before you go, can
yes,
I add
go
something
ahead.
to that?
Yes.
Well, I'm not an operator. I mean, I just want to share what I'm hearing from some of the partners, that they're really looking for the mix, right? That they need, you know, speed, range, weapons load capability, and survivability. So it's trying to find that combination with the F-35.
Well, and we shouldn't forget what drove air forces in the most part to these non-dispersed, deeply centralized patterns. It wasn't necessarily the aircraft, although they have got more difficult in most cases more complicated to do this sort of dispersed operations with. It was cost. So you can make most jets, you can make an F-22 able to operate in a dispersed manner from all sorts of places. It's just going to have to buy a hell of a lot more incredibly expensive spare parts, train a lot more people, have a lot more weapons and things basically pre-positioned around or ready to go in large numbers of C-17s or C-130s. It's perfectly doable. It's just much more expensive than a centralized operating model. So the question is, how much money do you want to put into it?
Okay, Rick, I can see you nodding there.
No, just concur with both last comments. Thanks.
So, Justin, I'd be interested to get your comments on this next question from Tim Robinson, the Royal Aeronautical Society. What are the panel's thoughts on a post-Ukraine war security environment? Should NATO be planning for a long-term Ukraine air policing mission?
So the only reason why we would end up in a post-Ukraine war scenario is that the Russians feel that they have nothing further to gain by fighting. So first of all, we need to get there. In terms of that basically means breaking the Russian army in Ukraine in a convincing way so that they view, and also making the investments we need to make longer term for production and replacement of capabilities so they don't think they have an incentive to just keep going. So the big sort of question in terms of how that answer plays out to Tim's question is, what state are the Ukrainian armed forces? Because we will have to basically keep providing them with munitions, reconstruction support, supplies, doing the same for ourselves in order to keep it a post-conflict Ukraine. Because the danger is otherwise Russia will simply do what it's done in Syria, in Chechnya, and various other places, which is use a ceasefire for 6 months to rebuild its forces, reconstitute, get everything in place, and then go straight back in another offensive on its own time frame with its own choice of location. So what does post-war Ukraine look like? It depends how we set up the investments now to give ourselves the ability to fight it for the long term. If we can fight it long term, we won't have to. That's the weird paradox.
Okay, General Hecker, would you agree?
Yeah, I think for the most part, I think the big thing is how does the post-Ukraine conflict look like? Is it, the borders that we have kind of right now, or is it the borders that Ukraine has gained back? And I think President Putin is going to have to he needs an elegant way out of this that he can, I don't want to say declare victory, but not have defeat. So I think it kind of depends on how it's going to end up on what is going to be the requirement from NATO to be able to do air policing and these kind of things based on what happens afterwards. But we're starting to do some things now, as you heard with F-16 training and those kind of things. I don't think you'll see a huge short-term effect from doing those kind of things, but I think the long-term effect, 5, 6, 7 years from now, of doing that will make it more stable and less reliant on NATO.
Okay, thank you. Marshal.
Thanks. So I was on a panel recently at the Paris Air Show with General Hecker and our Estonian colleague, who was also on the panel, used the phrase that Russia will always be our neighbour and history repeats itself. So there will definitely need to be a focus on whatever a post-shooting effort looks like in Ukraine. I think it's been pretty clear from the West that we're in it for the long haul. That's been reinforced with some of the statements, G7, NATO, etc., over the last 2 days of Vilnius. But what it looks like in terms of securing the borders once the war has been won, that work's ongoing at the moment. I know personally we're involved intimately with a lot of that work. The key for me, what success would look like, would be enabling Ukraine to do it on their own. That's what success will look like.
Okay, thank you. And this really does segue. You talked about Estonia. This question from Doug England. What happens when the high north and eastern flank doesn't provide... Actually, it's a slightly different question. It was just flicked up. But there was a question about Finland's addition to NATO, and of course with Sweden as well. Our northern flank has expanded significantly. What challenges does the panel foresee in securing and maintaining a strong air-based deterrent over this vast new area of NATO territory? Now, this has come from Matthew A. And interestingly, I was in Tromsø in northern Norway, just above the Arctic Circle, in January, and this was, a real key debate at a big Arctic conference that I was chairing. The very fact that you will need a lot more infrastructure in the high north, as was explained about Russia's developments. I think you were talking about in the Russian Arctic. But of course, there is a real controversy at work because of the sustainability challenge. I mean, these are pristine Arctic lands. How do you see this playing out, Major General? Just the very fact that you've got to bring public opinion on side to enable these kind of more industrial military bases to be set up.
That was a wide question to answer. I think, first of all, I think the whole perspective on the Nordic part and Sweden, Finland becoming a kind of additional task for NATO to handle, and that's going to strain us is kind of a wrong angle to it. Of course, I'm biased in this situation. I think 1 + 1 is 3 in this occasion. And I think, we still have to figure out what kind of investments and footprint that means, and to make decisions on that as well. But I think we from the get-go and from the start, having the opportunity soon enough, I hope, to plan our defense in a wider picture together is going to be a step up right from the beginning.
So this does lead to Doug England's question: what happens when the High North, and he says also the eastern flank, doesn't provide the critical runway opportunities to support runway-dependent assets? Is that something you could answer?
Can I have the question again?
Yeah. Do you believe that you're providing critical runway opportunities to support runway-dependent assets in the area under question, the High North?
Yes.
You do. There we are. That's your answer. Okay. Right, let's move on to the next question.
Really, I think of this as not a burden at all. This is a huge asset.
Yes.
With Finland and Sweden coming in. Think what they're bringing. Finland's bringing in, 64 F-35s. We're getting the Gripen EFs coming out of here. We got a package now that is going to put an AOC together where they can kind of intertwine and work and basically get after the A2AD independently, maybe with the 4 nations in the Arctic. This is a huge asset. So I don't look at it as a burden at all.
Marshal, you're nodding.
I absolutely agree. I think the comment earlier around this idea that we need to build there to be able to protect it, I think is slightly flawed. I absolutely agree with the discussion earlier around a requirement for better polar coverage, particularly from space, and getting the right architecture in space to underpin that. That's required for sure, because that's literally a bit thin in the ground at the moment. But I'm with General Hecker. This is a 1 and 1. 1 + 1 = 5.
Rick Brackenbridge, could I get your take on this?
Yeah, thanks.
What actually you do believe the kind of capabilities that would be needed in the High North?
Well, before I get to the solutions, I do think this unifying solidarity in the High North is so critical to send a marker, much like the AUKUS agreement to sort of push back against China and potential belligerent actions in the Westpac. I'm very pleased to see this type of unity and the ability to really test sharing of capabilities across Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland. So I think it sends a very, very strong statement. There will be some challenges associated with it, for sure. And so we'll just have to work through those like we do with other things, but no turning back. Technologies, as we mentioned, from space, and again, that high altitude, long endurance stare, the ability to see movement, anticipate, types of nefarious activities by the threat is going to be really important. I'd say land-based radars increased on the Finland border will be necessary, to again get a little bit more of the cueing, the indications and warning that can provide more opportunity for the Nordic nations to respond.
Do you mind if I add briefly? Just, I think we often forget, those of us who aren't fighter pilots by trade, much to my chagrin myself, but quite how huge the distances are when you start going up into those air defense identification zones or areas of interest in the Arctic. You're looking at distances that are equally as big as the Indo-Pacific, if not larger, where there are no divert airfields for huge areas of space, where if you eject, you will die long before anybody ever gets to you, if they ever get to you at all, where GPS doesn't work terribly well, where orbital assets are very difficult to keep in position in terms of the orbital mechanics involved, and where, quite frankly, there's also very limited radar coverage and very limited sensor coverage. Now, of course, those limitations and challenges affect both sides equally up in the High North, but I think it's actually really a case for NATO nations and NATO air forces specifically that have deep, long-term expertise in operating in that environment, particularly the Canadians, the Americans, in terms of the USAF units that spend time up there, for example, out of Alaska, as well as, of course, the Scandinavian air forces that do this regularly. It's a case for specialization. I think broader NATO trying to kind of have maybe a rotation of forces going through Iceland or Greenland, let's say, is really suboptimal, because units that go up there, if they haven't done it before or very often, it's going to take a lot of training to get them up to speed up there. You're taking them a lot more risk taking them up there than units that are used to it. And also, you know, some of the smaller NATO air forces, like, for example, the Canadians, are really good up there and perhaps offer slightly less in the really highly contested areas closer to the Eastern Front. So, you know, there's probably an argument for specialization in the Arctic even more than in a lot of other areas of air operations.
Major General Wikman, would you agree that specialization has to become the way forward? How would you see a kind of rotation working?
Yeah, I think, I mean, to us it's obvious, you know, I can echo Justin on that. To operate in that kind of an environment is kind of it's a bigger challenge than you might think. Normally when we we train a lot of units there. I think the interest and the progress is going that way. A lot of units from all over the world are coming to train in the Arctic environment. And, you know, the first week is always, you know, coming there to train, but in reality coming there to survive. And then the next year, you know, we'll be able to train a little bit and so on. So, but I think that's we're getting there. So.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's move on to another question from Alan Antrovus. And this is Professor Bronk painted a picture whereby the Russian industrial base is preparing for a long conflict. Can the panel envisage changes to national defence industrial strategies across NATO and what they might look like? Could you take this, General Hecker?
Well, I think it's very important that we kind of take stock of where we are in our weapon state across the 32 nations of NATO. And we're getting way down compared to where we were. If you look at the U.S. itself, and let's not just talk about the munitions we recently have given away to the Ukraine, but we're roughly half the number of fighter squadrons that we were when we did Desert Storm. I think you're down to about a third of the fighter squadrons that you used to have. So we don't have nearly what we had at the heart of the Cold War. Now you add that we're giving a lot of munitions away to the Ukrainians, which I think is exactly what we need to do, but now we're getting dangerously low and sometimes, in some cases, even too low, that we don't have enough. And we need to get industry on board to help us out so we can get this going. And as was mentioned, I think, Harvey, you were talking about it. I think it was Justin. Some nations are doing it better than others, but all 32 nations need to start doing that because we're dreadfully below where we need to be. And it's probably not going to get better. Well, it's not in the short term, but we got to make sure in the long term we have the industrial base that can increase what we have.
This is highly tricky, though, an environment where you might have an unstable political environment that certainly the UK has experienced over the past few years or so. How do you best kind of see your way through the fog and try and achieve what you need when you don't necessarily have the political support? What else can you do?
I think you got to just go over and over and over, and state what to us would be the obvious, but to our political leaders. I think we have been successful in the United States Air Force talking to our political leadership in the House and in the Senate about the threat that China has on us. And I think that is energized and given, our defense budgets are going up. And I think they finally realize, what a threat China will be. And then, of course, it's pretty obvious the threat that Russia is based on what they've recently done with Ukraine. And I think we've turned the corner. Now, it took our chief of staff several visits over to Congress and Senate talking to individuals over and over and over again. But I think once they got the classified briefings behind it and understood it, I think it was easier for them to make the decision and support what we were asking for.
Okay, thanks very much, General. And as far as the industry is concerned, how easy would you say it is to speak to the political classes to create some kind of urgency as well? I mean, what kind of hurdles have you had to overcome?
I say from my perspective, if I can pile onto what General Hecker said, I mean, this munitions issue has been an issue for decades. And I think there's, if we look at history, The U.S. used to have stocks of weapons that many of the partners knew that they could draw down on and replenish later. We're not in that situation, and I think one of the comments you made is if there were a conflict in two regions of the world, not only weapons, but refueling assets, ISR, it'll be split, and we collectively need to make sure that we have enough for both. So as far as the demand signal, we're all talking about it, but what it really takes, what industry needs, is the request, a written on-paper request, so we can start those production lines that you need. And industry, it's hard for us to make the investment unless we know that it's really there. So we want to make sure that we are investing where you have the biggest demand today and in the future. And then also we need to hear from you the other. If we are keeping something alive that you're like, I don't think we're going to need that any longer. Well, let's talk about it so that we can take those assets and realign those. So I think it's back to where my comments were. The more we can have that collaboration, it is really amazing when you go from your government hat to industry. Within a week, you're kind of out of touch about what the needs are. And it needs to be a continuous dialogue on what your requirements are with the changing security environment.
Breckenbridge?
Yeah, thanks. You put the rudder over on the aircraft carrier, it takes a while for it to turn. I am encouraged by the resolve of European nations to increase their proportion of defense spending within their budgets. Over lunch, I got a New York Times article that really heralded that this is real, and there is this true understanding of the nature of the threat. It is longer term than Ukraine, and that the appropriate investments need to be made to counter that. So I think from an industry perspective, that's encouraging to see. I will say that just because the money's there doesn't mean that's going to solve the problem, and that we have to be much smarter with how we use the treasuries of all those nations. And General Hecker sort of began in his opening remarks, there's ways that we can do this smarter, not a lot of duplication and multiple contractors that are providing similar capabilities. I think we're going to have to get a lot more focused with how we tackle that problem. I think industry's at a place where they're much more interested in doing that. Another false dichotomy that I've seen recently, coming out of the Paris Air Show, was a sense that, hey, we want to rely less on U.S. Defense products, and we want to have this indigenous capability within Europe. Well, our supply chains are so intertwined between the U.S. and Europe right now. It's sort of like the roots under a forest. There's a lot of things that are already happening at the supplier level that fortifies both the big primes in the European industry as well as the U.S. industry. And we just need to continue to work on those partnerships, not as much, hardball between competitors, but more of a unifying way to approach the market and do things smarter, because we can't afford to be inefficient with taxpayer dollars.
If I can just add on to that, because that is out of the Paris Air Show, and there was just a recent article on that about to buy Europe over buying the U.S. So I did a little fact finding, and UK alone, Boeing has invested over £12 billion since 2015 in the supply chain here in the UK. So if we picked apart and put a picture of a lot of the U.S. platforms and showed all the global suppliers, I think that's what we need to talk to the politicians about, that in order to get the warfighter what they need, we need to put some of this political aside and make sure they understand how it is helping economies and prosperities in each of the countries. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to move some questions in the audience now. There's a question in the front row. Please, can you introduce yourself? I think, yeah, there's the mic coming. Thank you.
Air Vice Marshal, Captain Z, AOC23 group in the Royal Air Force. So we've talked a lot about technology, innovation, and the things that we need in the inventory. But we haven't talked about what I think is our recent successes, the way in which we fight. Jonas, you mentioned something interesting about C2 not being dependent on centralized command. So how are we ensuring that our Air C2 model and the way we fight is fit for purpose for the next iteration?
We, at AirCom, as well as my other hat at USAFE, I've challenged the AOC commanders basically to come up with a different way to command and control that doesn't put all of our eggs in one basket. So we haven't figured it out yet, but we're basically going down some roads. We've already bought some equipment with portable SIPR, portable NATO secret stuff where we can disperse and get around. We're going to be talking with industry to see what we can do to make sure that we have reliable comms so that we can always talk to one another. And there's some interesting things in industry which makes that look like it's going to be a little bit more reliable with as many of the space launches that are going on right now, that we might be able to do that. So we're not there yet, but we do have a task force at both my AOCs where we're getting after that.
Marshal?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think over the last couple of decades, as we have conducted ops in deserts various and improved our technology in a way that those that sit in the rear are able to reach into, let's say, the cockpit of our operators. It has changed how we do our business in terms of empowerment at the front, and that's something we need to reverse, and we've got quite used to that. But certainly the Air Force I joined, you got your mission type orders, and regardless of whether or not you maintain connectivity to your higher headquarters, you were able to at least go and get after the commander's intent. And it feels like we've gone a little bit back to the future on that. And this is definitely something we're trying to exercise as we get into our approach to ACE, with A being the most important bit. And that agile isn't just about airplanes operating from a snow-capped runway. It's about how our youngsters actually get after their business. And doing that from when the day they join the service to the day they become senior leaders, empowering them, trusting them to make good judgment, giving clear direction from the top, giving them a left and right of arc within which to operate. So it does feel a little bit back to the future. It's not easy to change that culture, and it will take some time.
Okay, and the next couple of questions I have are about talent. So we have one question which has come through about talking about how it's very difficult to be able to train fast jet pilots due to the lack of funds for many air forces, including the Royal Air Force. This is from Norbert Tarnowski. So how can EU nations and the UK up their air superiority if they're still playing catch-up? And another, along the similar theme, is actually trying to get young people into the military in the first place. What are your thoughts around the issue of getting Gen Z young adults to join up, and also the appetite Western European and those adults have for a major conflict on the eastern flank if Russia triggers an Article 5? So, would you say that again?
Yeah, I'll jump straight in. I don't think we have a problem getting youngsters into an Air Force. Everybody wants to be a fighter pilot. Last year, I think I'll get these stats slightly wrong, but we had something like over 16,000 applicants for about 50 pilot positions. We do not have a problem attracting. We have a challenge in retaining talent, because they come to the service, we teach them very high-end skills, not just aircrew, engineers, mission support, intelligence. And the trick is, how do we keep them in the service and really exploit that experience, particularly when they're at the kind of 10 to 15-year point. And that's certainly a big focus for the Royal Air Force. My counterpart, DCAS, if he's here, I can't see with the bright lights, but if he were on stage, he would say his top 3 priorities are retention, retention, retention.
Would you say that's the same priority in Sweden?
Yeah, I think more or less exactly the same problem. I see. I mean, we're still recruiting a lot, but retention is we're struggling with, and I think it's going to be a broad spectrum of changes there as well to adapt to new generation. I think we are losing some people along the way that would wish to stay, but there's a lot of competition going on, especially for the Air Force. I think. I mean, a lot of our categories of personnel is also the same kind of personnel that's needed in the industry, for example. So it's going to be.
So you're to blame for this shortfall.
It's a partnership.
Yeah. So it works both ways. And what's the US Air Force doing in terms of really trying to get a handle on recruitment and retention? Is it, again, it's not so much recruitment but retention? Or
It's actually a little bit of both in the U.S. right now. This is going to be our first year that the Air Force hasn't met its recruiting goal. So we're putting a lot of emphasis on that, and I think we'll get that. Unfortunately, the pool of folks that are actually recruitable, that qualify to go in the military, keeps shrinking. So it becomes harder and harder as we move on. But we'll work through that, and I think we'll get the recruiting goal. As far as the retention, I think it's just like everybody else. Our folks are just so talented. When we recruit these 18-year-olds and they become cyber experts or they become space technicians and they can get out and make 3-4 times the money, it's hard to keep them in. So we do stuff like retention bonuses and stuff like that. But it's got to be more than that, because we'll never be able to compete with industry, whether it's a pilot or whether it's a cyber expert or whether it's a space expert. And as what used to be primarily a military mission, space, and as it becomes more commercialized, it's going to be harder and harder to keep them away from industry.
Okay, thanks very much. Yes, go ahead.
Just the two fingers on from a fast jet major equivalent who shall, from an Air Force that shall remain nameless, because I think it probably applies to quite a lot. Just put it really neatly to me in why he was thinking of leaving quite recently on a visit. He said, "I am massively overpaid for the flying bit of my job. I would do it for free. Hell, I would pay for it. I am grotesquely underpaid for the number of hours I have to work on mind-numbingly tedious other tasks and wading through bureaucratic rubbish." He used a different word than rubbish. And so if I want to be that stressed, I can make 3 times the money in the public sector, so in the private sector, so I'll go do that. If they want to make my job actually livable and sustainable, then I'd be delighted to continue flying jets for as long as they'll let me. And I've heard similar themes from a huge number of air forces. It does strike me that a lot of them train $5 million equivalent to be fantastic warfighters on fast jets, and then make them spend most of their time working 70 to 100-hour weeks doing absolute rubbish that has nothing to do with flying.
Would it be fair to say, Marshal, that there is increased bureaucracy? Oh, sorry, it's the wrong time to ask.
No.
Don't give you a moment.
So I'm not going to. I'm at risk of stealing our chief's sandwiches tomorrow. I'm preempting what Kaz will say in his speech. But alongside retention, one of our key focus areas at the moment is to try to cut through that bureaucracy. It's absolutely recognised. We have it too. I'm sure Kaz will say tomorrow, 90% of this process, we actually did it to ourselves. This is self-harm at its extreme. And we're challenging the Air Force to become more optimised. And we're reaching out to the squadron level, where frankly, that's where the expertise is. Most people on a squadron will say, if only I was king for a day, I would do it this way. So we're saying, okay, well, what way would you do it? And the perfect example of how this has come to life is with our rivet joint squadron. Many will know we only have 3 rivet joints, and a very, very highly sought after asset, particularly with the conflict in the East. And by listening to that squadron and enabling them from the top by cutting through a lot of the process that was hampering them, they've been able to increase their output by upwards of 200% without any uplift in resource, people, more money or more equipment, just by doing things in a more optimized way. So we've established an overall program for the RAF called our Enterprise Optimization, or just Optimize, which currently sits under me, and we're championing that as we go forward to try to drive as much of this process out so that a person can earn the money that they're being paid to actually sit in the cockpit.
Great, good to know, because of course having the right staff is going to be absolutely vital going forward, given the capabilities required, as we've been outlining today. I just want to bring the focus back to Ukraine for the moment, because we've only got 20 minutes left. And just an hour ago, the UK Defence Secretary stated that NATO is not an Amazon service for weapons to Ukraine, and that Kiev should be more grateful. I haven't got the exact form of words, but that appears to be the summary. I mean, this does really seem at odds to the message, doesn't it, that equipping is vital for collective defence. Is there any kind of quick reaction just to whether or not this has started to show more fracture? General, what's your take on it? You don't have to go too political, but in fact, what we had been seeing, say, yesterday and earlier today was actually, it seemed to be that NATO was coming together more and that there was more agreement compared to some of the fracture that had been expected in Vilnius.
Yeah. I think, when Putin decided to invade Ukraine, I don't think he figured, he didn't think that NATO would come together like they did. And I think it was the fact that we shared information that we typically would never share because of the way we have got the intelligence and the way that we basically said, here's what he's planning on doing. He's going to attack, and then he's going to put these cadavers around. He's going to say that he was attacked and that he's just defending himself. Because that was put out there in the information space, we won that big time, and it brought NATO together. And as I said, Secretary Austin 13 times has brought in not only NATO nations, but a lot of other nations to the tune of 52 of them the last time he did it. And all these folks are donating different forms of equipment. Some can give more than others, et cetera. But when's the last time Putin got all his Minister of Defenses together? Mm-hmm. It would be a joke, right? If he tried to do it, he might get a couple, maybe. And we get 50 all the time. We're definitely on the right side of the ball on this one. And I think we're moving fine. And when you look at it, since the invasion, I think we've had 5 countries buy the F-35. Everyone's getting tight. It's just gone extremely bad for President Putin, and it's doing real well, and I think we're still pretty tight on the NATO side.
Do you think this is thanks very much, Jonas, is this a kind of misunderstanding of the art of negotiation, that you ask for more in the hope that you'll get as much as possible?
It could be. I'm not sure I'll be drawn on it.
Okay. Moving on, I'm going to get Justin's point of view because I'm sure you do have one in terms of, as we've heard before, I mean, what's your take on we already know the sheer amount of munitions that you believe are required, not just now, but in the longer term. Are you concerned about fracture in NATO?
I'm not terribly concerned about fracture within NATO. Stand fast some decisions by Hungarian and Turkish colleagues that are sometimes less than helpful. But, broadly speaking, the alliance, as has been said, has come together brilliantly. I think there are difficult dynamics to manage between the Ukrainian side and NATO partners, and particularly key allies, that essentially boil down to there is a limited amount of trust in some parts of the Ukrainian state, and remember the Ukrainian state is not a unified entity. In much the same way as many post-Soviet states, and post-Soviet's an outdated term, it was a long time ago, but essentially there is, because on our side, some of these statements about why we don't want to, or why we're choosing not to supply certain systems don't necessarily make sense, and the reason for that is we don't want to disclose the actual reasons why we don't want to supply those systems. But what that leads to is the Ukrainians, and it's partly just natural suspicion on their part, they're fighting a war of survival, feel that they have to sometimes try and game the request in order to try and kind of select what they think it is that they want to be delivered. And what the NATO position is generally is, tell us what effect you want, tell us what effect you need, we know our systems very well, we will then supply you as best we can from the inventory. When that works, it works very well, and sometimes I think you just get breakdowns in trust, and also the perception from the Ukrainian side is always things are being held back a bit, and it's not that that's necessarily the case or not the case, but I don't think we should use terms like ungrateful, given that they are suffering an unbelievable amount of loss and pain in a way that we thankfully don't have to do so. I would say, from personal experience, one of the things that strikes you when you're there is it's not just the physical casualties. It's things like every single train and every bus and coach that leaves, there are men putting their wives and their children onto those to go back out of the country and watching them just crying through the glass each time, thousands of them. Every single bus, every single train, these are millions of lives that have been ripped apart. So I think using terms like ungrateful, even where it might feel true, is probably unwise.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And there is a question just for you, Justin. Does European air superiority include, do you think, providing F-16s to Ukraine besides shoring up the continent's air defences? I mean, drawing on what we were talking about in terms of the industry request of, we need to know the capabilities that are required. What do you think is most required right now?
On the air side, I think there are two questions. There's the question of how do we give Ukraine a sustainable self-defense combat air capability from whatever time a ceasefire is established. I think F-16 is critical to that. It's the most obvious choice. There's a very large user pool, lots of spares, lots of allies and partners nearby that operate the jet, can help train, can help support. It's a very capable multi-role system that's very upgradable. There's loads of good things about it. It's not the easiest thing to maintain dispersed. It's not the easiest thing to prepare airfields to a suitable condition. And therefore you would have to prepare lots of them to avoid being easily identified and hit. Russian missiles can still hit pretty much anywhere in Ukraine with enough saturation, and air defense is limited. So in terms of capacity, it's a very big country. So there are, I think, difficulties with supplying it up front, and then there's a question of whether an air-to-air missile will be provided with sufficient range to be competitive against the VKS fighter patrols. To me, the key requirement from an air perspective in the shooting war, which is the other part of what can we provide to help with the shooting war, if you can provide something that will be able to keep the VKS, the Russian Aerospace Forces, combat air, at arm's length as a supplementary capability to the main ground-based air defense, the limitation there being ammunition and available systems, then that is worth an enormous amount to buy out the risk of Russian air superiority at some point down the line in a few months. That's probably Meteor, and it's probably Gripen, if it can be done.
Okay, let me get General's perspective on that. Would you agree with Justin's assessment?
I think so. The problem that Ukraine will always have is it's going to be very difficult for them to roll back the Russian integrated air and missile defense systems. And they have some very sophisticated one when you talk SA-21s, extremely long ranges that F-16 and even fifth gen can be vulnerable to some of those systems. And that's just a fact of life that they're going to have to live with. But the good news is they will have some of those systems as well, so they'll be able to roll back the not their IADs, but their aircraft from flying over the Ukraine. So they'll kind of use that back and forth. And I don't see us, Ukraine getting the capability to do a counter A2AD against Russia, and F-16 alone is not going to give them that.
Okay. Well, thank you. I know we've got a couple of questions from the audience. I can't quite see them, but if you could raise your hands. There's one just here and the fourth row back. Thank you.
Brigadier Al-Nasser, Air Mobility Commander, Qatar Air Force. Thank you for the beautiful panel. My question is to Professor Justin, but I welcome any valuable contribution from the panel. You suggested that the Wagner commander's attempt wasn't a coup. So was it a stunt or a simple breakup? And how much does that affect the Russian troop morale? We spoke a lot about innovation, about tactics, but how much morale weigh into this war? Thank you.
Thank you. So the first thing I would say is I don't know what it was. All I would say is that the face value interpretation doesn't necessarily add up based on what we can see, which of course is very limited. All of the real negotiations governing the interactions that went down there are things that you and I simply will never see, and they're deeply personal. So for example, one of the gentlemen conducting negotiations on film with Prigozhin in Rostov is very senior GRU, and they know each other personally and have done for a very long time. That looked like a very relaxed set of discussions, given that what was supposedly happening. I think also it's worth remembering that in a system as paranoid as the Russian system, it's dangerous to set up even an elaborate piece of theatre, if that's what it was, for whatever reason, because you never quite know whether everyone involved is going to have been, well, they're probably not going to have been briefed in full as to what the plan is. So people might do stupid things like shooting down an IL-22 and 3 helicopters, and then start bombing highways as the Russian Air Force in retaliation. In other words, I think there may well have been aspects that whatever it was that was planned didn't necessarily go as planned. But it's interesting, announcements suggested this morning that Wagner's going to not only continue to operate, but actually restart combat operations in Ukraine from 5th of August. Whether that's confirmed or not, I don't know, but it seems like Prigozhin has been rehabilitated, and I can't see that being the result if it was actually a coup.
Thank you very much, Justin. Would anybody else like to respond to that question? Or, we do have some others, so we can move on. Is there another question in the audience? Yes, just in the 5th row. Thank you.
Caroline Plember-Cloud. I'm quite a simple person, and quite a lot of this comes back to Justin's point about money. And I'm just wondering, the generals talked about how the political thinking has changed. But I'm a taxpayer, and I'm convinced we need to spend more money on defence. I would, wouldn't I? I'm sitting in this room. But how do we go about convincing the taxpayer or the general public that there is an existential threat and that we do need to spend more on defence, and that there are going to be some hard choices between some of the other spending priorities of governments? Perhaps you could offer perspectives from your different countries.
I'll tell you the perspective that I get when I go around to the 31, soon to be 32 nations in NATO. If I'm talking to Poland, Romania, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, you don't have to explain anything to them. It's right on their doorstep, right? So they don't question it at all, and I don't think their taxpayers, or the majority of them, don't question it. The further you get away, United States, Canada, Italy, France, you get a little bit more of that. So, or you get more of, hey, the taxpayer doesn't understand. So I think it's up to us, but also our political leaders, to let them know that, hey, this is truly a threat. And it's not just a threat to the Baltics and Poland and Romania, to the Eastern Front, and then I guess we can throw Finland up there, but it's a threat to all of Europe. And history has kind of shown that. And I think we just, it's going to be very difficult to convince the American public that they need to pay more money on defense. It really is, and I think it's difficult for Spain and Italy and Portugal to do the same thing, but we have to at least give it a try. So that would be my comment.
Major General Wikman, what would you say?
Yeah, I think from our perspective, I think the sense of urgency is there. I mean, I think like General Hecker said earlier, we need to keep explaining what's important and what kind of capabilities we need. But I think from a Swedish perspective, the sense of urgency is there. We have an increase in budget that is historically high. We have a new change in security policy leading up to future membership. And so I think I agree with the general that I think from a Swedish perspective, we are in that kind of influence area where the sense of urgency is there. Then we can always ask for more. We can always ask for a more rapid increase in budget. But I mean, we run out of 2 sectors that gets increased budget this budget year. So,
And Marshal?
So it's a very valid question. I think particularly for the person that's far removed from this, when they have a cost of living crisis to deal with and inflation increases, can't pay the mortgage, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very valid discussion point. I think for us in defence, it's less about, can we get more money? It's about absolutely optimizing every single penny that we spend, making sure that it's spent wisely on the right thing and that it earns itself in terms of a £50 billion budget that we get in defence. So making sure that every penny of that is spent wisely, and that links back to our Optimise programme, which we're right in the heart of. I do think the broader challenge at the moment, when we see, and the media has a role to play, I guess, when we see scenes coming out of Ukraine, it helps land it on the 6 o'clock or the 10 o'clock news. You don't have to work too hard to say this is important. The broader challenge will be when the shooting stops, peace will be declared. There'll be lots in the media about peace, and then that person on the street that can't pay their mortgage is like, well, that's fixed now. So why are we spending money on it? And that's where the challenge will be. We tend to have short memories, and people will be less concerned about the rebuild program of Ukraine than them actually winning the war. That again links back to us making sure we're optimizing every single penny we're spending.
Okay, thank you.
I'd like to add to that. I just believe deterrence is a lot less expensive than war, and history has shown that. And from a U.S. perspective, one of my favorite quotes is our first president, Commander-in-Chief George Washington, and his quote is, "To be prepared for war is the most effective way to preserve the peace." So we need to start funding deterrence now.
And if I could, Heidi, I was jotting down the exact same thought, but from the other side of the coin, and that is, I think one of the failings of effective deterrence is the populace begins to treat things like global prosperity as a right that is always going to be there. And I think that's part of our challenge is how do you effectively deter bad things from happening and still encourage the populace to recognize that the tax associated with being able to deter major war is necessary for us all to shoulder. And that's a very, very difficult challenge.
And is there an argument to say that actually it's the lack of deterrence and after Russia's annexation of Crimea and incursions into eastern Ukraine that actually has come back to bite?
Yeah, there's certainly there's an awful lot of destroyed schools, hospitals, and good roads in Ukraine that it would be much more cost effective to have spent more on capability for them before the war than to have spent money on, for example, fantastic highway construction, which was done. I think the thing I would try to just tack on, and I couldn't agree more, Heidi, that about war is so much more unimaginably expensive than deterring it, partly because once the war starts, it's so much harder to stop. Even if the original aims with which a country went to war are no longer viable or even visible, the sunk cost fallacy kicks in real quick, and it becomes very hard to stop. But the second thing I would just say would be more honest with the public about the state of affairs of the armed forces. Stop closing ranks with your MODs and trying to suppress whistleblowers and conduct investigations and find out who leaked. Address the problems, because until you address the problems with the public, why should they vote for more money for you? And also, I would suggest trying to be careful about the distinction between optimizing how you spend money, couldn't agree more, Harv, but also explaining to the public that efficiency in terms of how you might run a business in peacetime is actually the flip side of fragility. Resilience is inefficiency. War is inefficient. If you have redundant spares, weapons, bases, all of that, that is inefficient. But it's also the only way to get resilience.
Okay, thank you. We have time for one more question, and there's a question just over here on the right.
Hi, how are you? Vaga Maradian from Defense and Aerospace Report. Sir, I just want to tell you, talk to the media. We'll try to help tell your story on that. Justin, I felt somewhat flat a little bit in this audience. I apologize. Justin, maybe you can start off the discussion. This is a NATO discussion right out of Beijing today. It says, quote, NATO must promptly withdraw the black hand it has extended across the Asia-Pacific region. Looking forward to the next panel discussion on the Indo-Pacific with General Wilsbach and the team. To ask you guys, what are the Indo-Pacific, and Justin, maybe you can start us, the Indo-Pacific lessons from this conflict that we need to really be considering, given that the conflicts are very, very different in how they'll play out? Thanks very much.
I'll do a short intro. Indo-Pacific is not my speciality, sadly, but I would say that given the missile arsenal and the technical capabilities China has, I think countries in Europe looking to have a global influence in military terms should look really hard at their ability to warfight against Russia on their doorstep when judging whether they can add any serious warfighting capability in the Indo-Pacific against a country with 10 times the missile arsenal, far more capability, and at far greater distances.
Thank you. Anybody like to add anything to Justin's point? It was very succinct and to the point. No. Moving on. There is time for one more question, and just over on the right-hand side. Yes. We have another roving mic. Thank you. To your right.
Thank you. It's Stuart Arthur, BAE Systems. I guess it's about deterrent posture and then being ready to defeat. And it's really to get a view on what you think about the future of training and readiness, looking through the lens of air forces, looking through the lens of whole force, but also looking through the lens of the simultaneity that we just talked about.
I can address a little bit of that in 50 seconds, I think I got, right? In Vilnius, there's these regional plans that are new to NATO. And those regional plans are allowing us as an Air Force to do a lot more detailed planning than we have in the past. In the past, we could do what's called prudent planning, which isn't detailed at all. And what constituted prudent planning wasn't much at all. So now we're doing a lot more detailed planning, and hopefully eventually we're going to be doing detailed rehearsals with actual aircraft, and we're starting to do that now, but we're going to get a lot more serious about it, and I think that will make us much more ready and efficient on day one, where we can, basically go at scale with all of NATO, as opposed to a few countries before we kind of gather and get everybody together. So that's what we're striving for at AirCom.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And it was just a minute, so well done, General, for finishing us on time. We will, of course, be continuing the discussions about the Indo-Pacific in the next session. I do want to take this moment to give the panel a really big round of applause. We've covered so many subjects. So thank you.